Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. Today is Saturday, June 8th, and this is my weekly wrap-up. So I'm participating in June on the Range, which is an event created by the great Michael K. Vaughan. And the event this year is hosted by a considerable posse, and I'll list everyone in the notes to this video. One of the prompts is to read a novel by Zane Grey. Well, I've never read any Westerns before that I can think of. So Zane Grey is totally new to me. I decided to read Riders of the Purple Sage. This was written in 1912. And it is considered to be a seminal work in the Western genre, one that created the formula for the genre. Truthfully, knowing next to nothing about this genre, I can tell you that I picked this book, Riders of the Purple Sage, not because it's a seminal work in the field, but as I mentioned in another video, because in the 1970s I followed a band that was an offshoot of the Grateful Dead, and this band took their name apparently from Zane Grey. This band was the NRPS, or the New Riders of the Purple Sage. So when I went looking for Zane Grey novels, this was the first one that I found, and I thought, that's the one I'm going to read. Nothing to do at all with anything about Zane Grey or about this novel and its importance in the genre. So I went into this novel with no real expectations, and I was actually surprised in many ways by what I found there. One of the aspects that really surprised me is that Zane Grey makes Mormon men the villains in this novel. They are just depicted as pure evil. One of the main characters in the novel is Jane Witherstein, and she is a Mormon woman who is a very wealthy ranch owner. And she's a good and kind character. She performs acts of generosity and kindness to Mormons and non-Mormons, called Gentiles in this novel, alike. She just does good wherever she goes. The primary villain in the novel is a man named Elder Tull, and he wants Jane Witherstein as his third wife. He, of course, also would like her land and her wealth. Jane, at the beginning of the novel, has a close relationship with a non-Mormon, who's another one of the main characters in the book. This is Bern Venters. At the novel's opening, she's very, very good friends with Bern, and she has no intention whatsoever of marrying Tull. So Tull and his other churchmen, who really are depicted as common thugs, are about to brutalize this Bern Venters, at the opening of the novel, when one of the novel's chief heroes, a gunman named Lassiter, suddenly arrives on the scene, and he intervenes and stops this act of brutality that's about to occur. Lassiter is on his own mission, and it is a mission against the Mormons, but prompted by his desire to find his long-lost sister. But he really, in the course of the novel, he represents, the mysterious outsider who, shows up in the nick of time and brings justice to the scene. Gray's obvious disdain for Mormons was very surprising to me. Now, I'm going into this knowing nothing about him and nothing about his relationship with Mormonism. The Mormon men in the novel set about trying to destroy Jane's ranch in order to force her, against her will, to marry Tull and become his third living wife. The other aspect of the novel that really surprised me is the degree to which this was actually a romantic love story. That I was not expecting that either. Again, knowing nothing about the genre. Lassiter and Jane begin to fall in love, and then there's another side love relationship going on between this Burn Venters and a mysterious, first it's a mysterious masked man who Vern shoots, and then we find out that the mysterious masked man is actually a woman in disguise, and eventually these two characters have begin to develop a romantic relationship as well. It's another whole complicated story that I'm not going to go into here. There's a lot of gunfighting in this novel. There's a lot of violence, which I guess is par for the course for this genre. But what really struck me, and the other thing that I wanted to talk about, what really struck me about this was the absolutely beautiful nature writing. I didn't know anything about Zane Grey as a stylist, as a prose artist. He has some dialogue in the novel that's a little corny and stilted, but when he's describing setting, he does a really, really magnificent job. Apparently, he had a desire to depict the undisturbed wilderness, and I was just struck by what a really good nature writer he is. And I wanted to just read a couple of just short paragraphs just to give you a taste of what I'm talking about. So this is relatively early in the novel when Venters is out. He's now left. He's been rescued by Lassiter, and now he's off riding around on his horse. And he describes, or the narrator describes, what Venters is experiencing. Then, his back against a stone, Venters faced the east, and, stick in hand and idle blade, he waited. The glorious sunlight filled the valley with purple fire. Before him, to left, to right, waving, rolling, sinking, rising, like low swells of a purple sea, stretched the sage. Out of the grove of cottonwoods, a green patch on the purple, gleamed the dull red of Jane Withersteen's old stone house, and from there extended the wide green of the village gardens and orchards marked by the graceful poplars. And farther down shone the deep, dark richness of the alfalfa fields. Numberless red and black and white dots speckled the sage, and these were cattle and horses. And then just another passage that I thought was also kind of breathtaking. And again, this is Venters. Venters turned out of the gorge and suddenly paused, stock still, astounded at the scene before him. The curve of the great stone bridge had caught the sunrise, and through the magnificent arch burst a glorious stream of gold that shone with a long slant down into the center of Surprise Valley. Only through the arch did any sunlight pass, so that all the rest of the valley lay still asleep, dark green, mysterious, shadowy, merging its level into walls as misty and soft as morning clouds. Venters then descended, passing through the arch, looking up at its tremendous height and sweep. It spanned the opening to Surprise Valley, stretching in almost perfect curve from rim to rim. Even in his hurry and concern, Venters could not but feel its majesty, and the thought came to him that the cliff dwellers must have regarded it as an object of worship. So, pretty magnificent. So, Riders of the Purple Sage has a complex plot with a few subplots. While, as I said, I found the dialogue to be a little stilted, and while I can't say I felt completely comfortable with this absolute vilifying of an entire religious group, I thought that the landscape writing was really, really beautiful. Okay. Next, I finished this week Zadie Smith's novel, The Fraud. I'm reading this for my in-person real-life book group. This is a historical novel, and it is set in 1873 in England. Charles Dickens is a character in the novel. Our main character is Mrs. Eliza Touchet, and she is a Scottish housekeeper who has been living for like 30 years in the house of her cousin through marriage, William Ainsworth. William Ainsworth was a once famous, successful novelist along the lines of Charles Dickens, who is now, in the present tense of the novel, not doing so well. He's having very limited success now as a writer. The characters in the novel become obsessed with the Tichborne trial, in which a man claims to be the long lost and thought to be dead Roger Tichborne. This guy comes forward and claims that he is this person who's been missing for many, many years, and he attempts to claim the family fortune, if he can first prove that he is not, in fact, a fraud. So I'm going to review this book next week after my book group meets, and we have a chance to talk about it. So more to come on Zadie Smith's 2023 novel, The Fraud. As I've mentioned in a couple of places, I am also in the middle of my reread of James Joyce's Ulysses. I'm reading Ulysses with the Ulysses Read-Along, which is being hosted by Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads and Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics. This is a read-along of this novel that we're doing throughout the months of June and July. We have a Discord group, and we have so far read the first 6 episodes during the first week of June. This is my 3rd reading of this novel, but I haven't read it since I was in my 20s. So there's been a huge span of well over 40 years since my last reading of this novel. There is much to be fascinated about in this novel. But it is also a tremendous amount of work. I alternate this time around, this third go, I'm alternating between wanting to dig in really deeply and read my corollary sources and read my old notes from graduate school. So I go between wanting to do a deep dive and just wanting to be reading a more straightforward narrative. And I really, in a given day, I go back and forth between these two, kind of polar opposites. The second time that I read this novel, I was in graduate school. And my brother had just died, and my father had died a little bit before that. And I was in a profound state of mourning. And somehow reading this book at that time was a transformational experience for me that I'm not even sure I can fully explain. But I was able then, as a 24-year-old young woman, graduate student, I was able to completely immerse myself in this novel. And I deeply identified with the two main characters, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom. Now you might think, what could a 24-year-old woman have really in common with Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, who don't have much in common with each other? Well, what they do have in common is that they are both, to some degree, paralyzed by guilt and an all-encompassing grief. In the case of Stephen, it is guilt and grief over the loss of his mother, and in the case of Leopold Bloom, it is guilt and grief over the losses of his father by suicide and his young infant son. When I was 24 years old, in a horrible state of grief myself, this was the right book for me at that time. I suppose it's good that it is no longer the case for me. But I'm also finding that I'm just less engaged this third time around. I am intrigued by aspects of the writing. I'm intrigued this time especially by ways in which Joyce is using themes, characters, motifs, structure from Homer's Odyssey. How he's using those in Ulysses. But that's making more of an academic exercise out of reading this book than just letting the narrative wash over me. It's becoming more of an academic exercise. I recently heard an interview with the contemporary Irish novelist Colm McCann, and he was talking about the impact that Ulysses had on him also when he was in his early to mid-20s. Talked about, not getting it at all when he was an undergraduate in college, but somewhere in his early 20s, he got it. And he said in this interview that he thinks it's a really funny book and a really sexy book. Not sure that I am having that experience of it. I mean, I know there is humor in it, but I don't think it's a really funny book, and I don't think it's a really sexy book either. But what I really liked about this interview was that he talked about embracing the difficult, embracing what is difficult. And he said that, in these days today, we put too much emphasis on what is simple. And he talked about how there can be something gratifying about doing the tough thing, stretching yourself. He talked about, doing the tough thing and stretching yourself, and in so doing, you become bigger. So I felt like it was a little pep talk, and I felt inspired again to continue forging ahead. I don't know if at this point in my life I am going to become bigger by reading this book for a third time, but I really like the group that we're reading it with. I'm enjoying the little discussions that we're having, and I'm going to just forge ahead. Okay. I'm also participating in Book Trek 2024, and I've chosen to read some old Star Trek novels from the original series because I'm old, and that's the only series that I know. It's the only series I ever took an interest in. I was a little kid when the series was originated in the 1960s, and I watched the series, and I saw all of the original movies, and I have a lot of the old books. So I'm in the middle of one now, but I'm going to wait until I have finished something to actually talk about my experience of revisiting Star Trek at this point in my life. And finally, the last thing that I read this week is a book of previously unpublished poetry that it's a collection of 50 poems collected by the poet laureate Ada Limon. This book, called You Are Here, Poetry in the Natural World, is a part of Ada Limon's signature project as the current poet laureate of the United States. So in putting this anthology together, which I read this week, she invited, I think, 50 contemporary poets to reflect on their place in the natural world. And to write an original poem that hadn't been published anyplace else and submit it to this collection. So it's a wonderful collection. It's a really, really beautiful collection. I've read some of these poems in my early morning poetry short videos that I've been doing, the ones that I can fit into a short. I've read some of them, but it's just a beautiful collection as a whole. Some of the poems are about the threats to our natural world. Some of them are just simply about the abundance of the natural world. Some are about the resilience of the natural world. Some deal with our ancestors and their relationship with the land, and others are poems addressed to children and grandchildren and their future relationship with the natural world. Ada Limon writes in the introduction to this collection, quote, "A poem can seem so small, so minor, so invisible, especially when up against the daily crises and catastrophes that our planet is facing. How can a poem make a difference? How can a tree make a difference? Perhaps the answer to these questions is that poetry and nature have a way of simply reminding us that we are not alone." So that's it for today. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.